what I want is for our future to rhyme with that past. And I don't want to regress to that past. I don't want to have infant mortality at 30% or 50% or 80%. Like, I want many of the benefits of advancing technology, but I want our daily experience and our relationships to rhyme with what I imagine the depth of relationships were, and the trust that existed in relationships were, and the time span of the relationships that we would have had 3,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, because they are the conditions under which our brain evolved.
My name is Simon Waller, and this is the Future with Friends podcast, a show where I make zero attempt to try and predict the future, even though I'm a trained futurist, and instead I enlist my friends to do it for me. Thankfully, I have some very smart and insightful friends. Some of them are best-selling authors. Most will be considered leading thinkers in their field of expertise. I guarantee that every single one of them will have compelling and unique insights to share about what might happen next. Each episode, I invite a friend onto the show to explore the future of anything that they would like. I then task them to go away and create a short scenario about that future set at least 5 years from now, something that captures their hopes and dreams, or maybe their fears and concerns. And then over the course of the show, we dissect that scenario. We start to think about the critical uncertainties, the alternate possibilities, and the decisions that we can make today to create the future that we want tomorrow. Welcome to The Future with Friends. Hello and welcome to episode 4 of The Future with Friends. Today I'm going to be joined by a very dear friend of mine, the wonderful Col Fink, and Col is going to share a very deeply personal scenario that he has written about the future of how we will live. Col is currently in the process of building a communal living space for him and 4 other families in Melbourne's outer east. This kind of grand experiment that he's running on his friends and his family is something he's been deeply invested in. And in this scenario, we start to think about how this might play out over multiple generations, what it might mean for his kids and even for his grandkids. Along the way, we explore some of the challenges that we might face in creating these types of utopian visions for human existence. We look at some of the challenges around automation and artificial intelligence and robotics and unemployment and universal basic income, and how do we even, as a government, govern these types of places together. It's a really wonderful conversation that I get to have with Col, and I love the picture he paints of the later stages of his life and the soundtrack that will be provided by his brother Cam sitting in a corner playing guitar. Welcome to episode 4 of The Future with Friends, and today I'm being joined by a very good friend of mine, the man, the myth, the legend that is Col Fink. Col, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Simon. Super exciting to be here. I'm a person, I think about the future a lot, and I'm really excited to have a conversation with an actual futurist to see whether my future thinking is misguided or potentially accurate. So I'm stoked to be on the program and I'm excited to see where the conversation goes.
Well, the good news is, Col, is no one actually knows what's going to happen in the future. So you can almost say whatever you want. We're very, very good as futurists. We try not to make predictions. We kind of just lay out some broad ideas around the future, which is kind of partly the point of the show. But I'm actually super excited about what you've chosen to talk about today. But before we get into that, just a little bit of a recap on the friendship. So I've known you now for around 12 years. When I first met you, you ran an online go-kart shop.
Yeah, correct. So I had run a go-kart manufacturing business, and then in one of the, I don't know, sometimes I'm ahead of the curve, sometimes I'm behind, but one of the ways that I was ahead of the curve was I got into video promotion on YouTube way earlier than most people. And so I turned my manufacturing business into a online shop and distribution business, which actually went pretty well. And I think within probably the first year or 2 of meeting you, I had made the decision to stop in the go-karting realm and kind of move into the next phase of my life. But I managed to build the business up to the point where I was able to sell it for an actual sum of money, which for a young entrepreneur was one of the most affirming moments of my life, honestly.
Yeah, look, I know lots of business owners that still haven't reached that dream. So to have done that at that age, congratulations. And along the way, you met like all the superstars of motorsport. Is that like a whole bunch of them that were go karting when they were 8 and 9 years old?
Correct, yeah. So my claim to fame is that I taught Daniel Ricciardo, the Formula One driver, at least a small amount of what he knows about how to drive. And there were guys who, yeah, like, because you can start karting when you're 7, like competitive karting, when you're 7 years old. It's unbelievable what the human child is able to learn to do, honestly. Like the level of performance that a 7-year-old is capable of in a go-kart is utterly mind-blowing. And these kids who are 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, when I first met them and was in this community and coaching some of them and competing against many of them, they are now all the big names on the supercars grid. And, you know, they're the Scott McLaughlin, who races Indy cars in the USA, and like literally Cameron Waters, Chaz Moster, all the guys who are like the big names of the sport now. They were these little tackers when I was there, and I don't know, it's a sign of my age that I'm now seeing these fully grown, successful adult humans living amazing lives, and I'm like, oh my gosh, in my head you're still 11.
I think that backstory though makes this conversation even, I think, more interesting and surprising. Because although that was what you were doing when we first met, what you do now is quite different. You now run this kind of what you call like the solopreneur community. I love this as a term that you coined and created yourself, and that maybe it will be like virtual reality. Like so, Jaron Lanier coined virtual reality in 1987. I imagine at the time no one really knew what he was talking about, but now it's like, oh yeah, I get what that is.
Yeah, that's just a normal thing. Yeah,
that's a normal thing now. And so solopreneurs, maybe this is your term that's going to take off, and in another 15 years or so time, we'll all get what that means. But for those who don't, do you want to give a little recap on it?
Yeah, for sure. So, like, traditionally, there's been two ways to make a living. And one was that you would start your own business and you would try to create an enterprise and you'd employ people and you'd build up this big thing with scale. And the other way was that you would join a business and that you would be an employee. And if you had visions of greatness or whatever, then you would climb the ladder. And there's actually this third option, which is growing in popularity, but which I don't think is still a particularly well understood field, which is the idea that you can actually be a business. And so rather than joining a business as an intrapreneur, you might say, or starting a business as an entrepreneur, what you can instead do is be a business as a solopreneur. And in particular, I'm interested in people who I describe as a solo pro. So a solo professional is someone who runs a solo business. And generally what we're doing is working with corporates or governments or organizations, and we're offering our skills as essentially a freelancer or a hired gun. And there's this wonderful opportunity that exists in the modern world, especially now that technology's made it so easy for us to deliver value through all these different tools and strategies, where you can essentially take your expertise and your insight and the knowledge that you've gleaned over the course of your life experience and offer it to, as I say, governments, organizations, anyone who you can help. And to do so in a way where I love to say you can make money meaningfully and freedomfully. And so for people in particular who value freedom, I reckon the life of the solo pro is an incredible blessing, because you get this unmatched ability to decide how you will spend your time. That's a level of agency that people in organizations, whether they own them or work for them, don't have, because you've got so many other obligations. As a solo pro, of course, you have an obligation to serve your clients, but you get to do so in such a way that you just have far greater agency and control over what your life looks like. And so I'm leading a community of people who are exploring how amazing it's possible to live a life in the present world by making money as a solo pro in a really meaningful way, and using the freedom that you're afforded as a result to, live life however you want to, and to make choices to spend it however you want to. And I'm doing a bunch of things which I think are a bit sort of anti-status quo, and exploring different ways of living, and that informs the scenario that I have put together with your help that we're going to be discussing today.
Yes. So The reason I want you to share that is exactly the point you got to at the end there. This is not actually a conversation about what you do for work. This is a conversation as friends. But yeah, I'm a part of this community, and one of the things that you are really big on pushing in that community is around this idea of freedom and how do we choose to live our lives. And as part of that, you've obviously shared a bunch of information around what you are doing in your personal life, which very much does inform the scenario that we're going to explore today. So do you want to start? So the future we're going to explore today is the future of how we live. Do you want to share a little bit about what it, the reason and the rationale behind choosing that topic?
Yeah, well, uh, my fundamental belief is that consciousness is the only place where value exists. If you imagine a universe where there is no consciousness, I think you've imagined a universe where there is no value. It's not possible for gold to be valuable or freedom to be valuable if there's not consciousness to value it. And so my fundamental underlying philosophy about what makes life good is essentially the well-being of conscious creatures. My vision for a utopia, if you like, is a place where humans and every other conscious being, which is a very, very, very large number of beings, in my opinion. I think it's crazy to assume that humans are the only conscious being. But essentially where the best world is the one where there's the most amount of well-being among all conscious creatures. And so I think that whilst technology's been amazing and there's been some undeniable pieces of progress, like, for example, the healthcare that means that infant mortality now is fractions of a fraction of what it was even only 200 years ago. At the same time, we've done some incredibly dumb stuff to make ourselves grimly unhappy, like the waves of depression and anxiety that are permeating modern society, to me, is incredibly sad. And I think it's a function of decisions that we've made. Like, I think we have, like, unwittingly made decisions that have led to people in our kind of Western developed society reliably developing feelings of depression and anxiety and all sorts of other mental health conditions. And I think that they are directly related to choices that we've made, deliberately or unwittingly, and they're choices that we can change. And so the world that I want to see develop over the rest of my life is one where more and more people are made more and more happy, or more, to develop greater and greater well-being, because we revisit some of the stupid choices that we've made as a collective, and we make those choices again. And whether there's policy changes, regulatory changes, cultural shifts, I reckon it's possible to take the technological advancements we've made and apply them in ways that make us even more happy and even more well, and lead even better lives. And I'm a relentless optimist. And so I hope to see the next, 40 or 50 years that I live, to see loads and loads of progress. And so the scenario I've written is essentially a picture of what some version of an emerging utopia might look like.
And it is actually based on something that's actually going on in your personal life as well. This, like, in terms of, so don't want to give away the scenario, but you want to talk a little bit about what you have been creating for your family that kind of has fed into this conversation as well.
For sure. So the scenario that I've drawn is an extension of something that I'm experimenting with my own family right now. And the thing that I have to recognize and acknowledge is that I am the product of some of the most concentrated privilege that's ever existed. I mean, already I think everyone who lives in a developed nation at this time of year is one of the most privileged, 1% of humans that's ever lived. And even within that 1%, like, I've come from a family, I was very lucky. My parents made plenty of money and they were great people. And I feel incredibly grateful for the privilege that I've had. I make pretty good money myself now. And essentially my family and extended family has the financial means to try things that not everyone has available to them. And I want to acknowledge that what we're doing is in large part a function of that privilege, and not that we're just kind of special or deserve it. But what we're doing is living communally. So we've actually bought a property on the outskirts of Melbourne. We live on 27 acres. We've got 50 sheep, 80 geese, 150 chickens, 4 dogs. We currently live in a family of, it ranges between 5 and 8 adults in the house at any given time. We currently have 5 kids. I'm expecting we'll end up with anywhere between 7 and 10 or something. I'm not quite sure. It includes 3 generations of people, and it's largely built around our family, but not exclusively. There are friends that live here full time who are not in any way blood related. All 3 of my children speak fluent Japanese. I don't speak a word of Japanese. And it's because we have Japanese people living with us constantly. We have like a sporting connection through my wife and ultimate frisbee that means we have this never-ending stream of the most amazing Japanese women coming to live in our house. But essentially, we live in what I would describe as a fairly unconventional and incredibly affirming and healthy way. What I'm trying to, like, the way we live is largely a product of a sales pitch that I delivered to my family about 7 or 8 years ago, where I painted a picture of what our life could be. And fortunately, a bunch of them bought into it and took a financial risk by literally buying into it. And what we're seeing is that the people in our family are very happy, very healthy, very supported, and we have great relationships. And it's largely a function, not that we're good people who happen to deserve it. I genuinely believe it's largely a function of how we live. And I believe the modern world has made mistakes, and we've turned an obsession with independence into an epidemic of isolation. And the way we're living is a deliberate attempt to reverse that. And I'm trying, funnily enough, so I really admire my father-in-law, Rod. He's an unbelievable human being, one of the coolest dudes I've ever met. And one of the things I've noticed about him is he never has his preferences met. Now, this is a guy who's made more money in his lifetime than most people ever would, right? He could buy whatever he wants. He could have whatever he wants. And his family loves him and respects him. They would do whatever he wants. He never, and I literally mean almost never, has his first preference met. Because what he's realized is he'd rather the people that he loves have their preferences met. And he's willing for it to be his second or his third preference if it means he can be close to his peeps and for them to be getting what they want. And I've seen him doing that over the last 10 or 12 years that I've known him. And I've thought, that's a guy I want to be like. I don't want to be the person who gets everything he wants. I want to be surrounded by people who are healthy and happy. And so I've essentially seen the way that Rod's approached being one of the luckiest people on earth and shared that with everyone around him. And I thought, I want to do that too. And so our life is an experiment in, living in a house that isn't the exact house you want. And it's not the house with the carpet that you would have chosen or the color that you would have painted the walls or the TV show that you would want to watch right now. But what it means is you're not alone. You're with people. And I reckon that is way more fundamental to our well-being than any particular preference you might have for something that you want.
Awesome. So I think that's enough of the backstory. We're going to jump into the scenario in the sec, or it might even perhaps be more appropriately called a sales pitch, because it feels like you pitched your family, they fully bought in, and now you have a chance to basically pitch everybody in the world on this. I mean, I'm not saying that the audience is quite that big yet, Col, but
I'm sure you'll get there, Simon.
We'll
8 billion people are going to subscribe to your podcast one day.
Excellent. Okay, so over to you, Col. Share us with your scenario about the future of how we will live.
Excellent. Darwin wakes up. She checks her kids' bedrooms and finds one still asleep. The other 2 are up and about. She can't hear them, so they're probably already at breakfast. She wakes up the 3-year-old and carries him out of the house to the mess hall. The other 2 are indeed already eating breakfast, scrambled eggs on toast with their Uncle Deacon, who is sharing a table with 7 kids in total, leading a ridiculous discussion about who would win in a fight between a Tyrannosaurus-sized deer or 100 deer-sized tyrannosaurs. Cam, Darwin's uncle, is playing guitar in the corner by the fire. He's about 85 years old at this point. She looks out the window. Mount Feathertop, in the Great Dividing Range, is capped with snow. and she's glad the global carbon tax was implemented before the runaway tundra melt began. She eats her breakfast quietly with her partner Jazz, because it's her day to run the school today, and she doesn't actually need extra time with the kids this morning before the school day begins. The hall is actually a little quieter than it is most mornings because Daisy, Darwin's best friend since childhood, and her family are visiting Tanzania for a month. It's been a little extra work tending to the chickens and mowing the lawns while they've been away because that's the jobs that their family is usually contributing to the collective. Darwin and her collective, 9 adults and 7 kids at this point in time, are one of the happiest groups of people to have lived in the last 500 years. They're in the unique position of enjoying the benefits of modern technology, most importantly maternal and child healthcare and the dramatically reduced infant mortality that's created, whilst also enjoying the benefits of a much more primitive aspect of human life that had been, for a time, largely forgotten: communal living. Of course, culture shifts slowly, and not everyone wants the more rural version of communal life that Darwin and her family enjoy. There are small rural communities dotting up everywhere now in areas surrounded by the growing forests, reclaiming unused farmland now that most animal protein is produced artificially. The idea of 15-minute cities in urbanised areas is still taking off, and governments have started toying with regulatory strategies to allow groups of friends and families to find housing within the 15-minute walking distance that promotes great connection. Unfortunately, there's also a large group of people suffering from the great drug addiction of the 21st century: personalised entertainment. It's possible to essentially plug yourself into a never-ending stream of dopamine-triggering entertainment, a form of leisure that unfortunately and reliably leads to anxiety and depression. The lesson we're still learning at this time is that independence, the ability to do whatever we want, often leads to isolation. Darwin hopes to teach her kids to use their independence to make choices that keep them in community with other people, compromising on many of their preferences in order to cultivate that which matters most: strong relationships with people who you love and who love and support you.
Excellent. What a great scenario. I love this. I love the rampant optimism in it as well.
I am nothing if rampagingly optimistic.
I forgot to actually ask you this question before, but what year do you see this scenario as being set in?
So Darwin is actually my daughter. She's currently 3. No, she just turned 4. And so I imagine this is when she's in her early to mid 30s or 40s. So perhaps this is 2060, something like that.
2060.
Something
Okay,
like,
cool.
yeah.
I love that Uncle Cam is in the corner playing his guitar. For those who don't know, Cam is Cole's brother. And you often see them twinning it up together on LinkedIn, doing little shows called The Fink Tank, which is beautifully titled. I know Cam as well, and the idea of him sitting in the corner playing guitar is just a perfect contribution to this scenario as well.
Well, that was a very selfish element too, I must admit, because my childhood, the soundtrack to my childhood was Cam becoming masterfully good at playing the guitar. And it's interesting, I love music, but I find I very rarely put it on the stereo. And I had this realization the other day. The reason is my entire childhood was punctuated by music played live by Cam, hours and hours and hours of practice every day. And one of the things I miss most about him, having found his own community and living over in New Zealand, he's just bought a house in Wellington with Alicia. One of the things that disappoints me most about that is I don't get to hear his guitar as often as I'd like. So in my imagined future scenario, they've moved back over here and they're in the community, and I get to start and end my life with the soundtrack of Cam playing guitar. So that was a little selfish element that I chucked in there.
Beautiful. I love it. I love it. And I do want to talk a little bit more about that. I feel like there's a thread for us to pull on there. But before we do so, I'd just like to check in with you because you are, as you pointed out earlier on, you are a non-futurist. And so I'm curious for you what it was like to write this scenario. Like, you're being asked to basically write a story about a future that could exist 30 years from now. What was that like as an exercise?
Really fun and exciting and also challenging. The the great realization that I've had on the end of it, and it's been really useful for me too, because honestly, what I'd love to do in 10 or 20 years is write a book about the experience that my family will have had by then in growing up in a community to hopefully influence culture and push it in a direction that I think would be healthy. And one of the things that I realized in writing this scenario was like how many different moving parts contribute to this. And so elements that came to mind when I was thinking about it were things like, yeah, what I hope is that developments in the way that we can grow and produce animal protein. Like I'm imagining we're going to have solar powered factories that take the raw materials and energy from the sun to produce all the meat that we need. And it means that we can return the world to a more natural kind of distribution of biomass. Because at the moment, something like 80% of all the mammal biomass in the world is human food, which is like sickening to me. And so I love the idea that all the farmland throughout Victoria where I live would start to be reclaimed by forests because we don't have to grow all those cows and sheep anymore. And then also things like I'm thinking that a universal basic income or something of that sort is going to dramatically change how we all live and work. And I think that is the thing that might allow people who don't have the financial means that my family has to experiment with the types of ways that we're living, because you don't have to live near the city for your job, because you don't need a job, because you get paid, I don't know, $80,000 a year, $100,000 a year, or whatever the equivalent figure is, just for being a human at a time when robots do nearly all the productive stuff that we need done. And then there's the cultural shifts that would need to happen. And like, there's so many moving parts, and no way am I smart enough, or, like no way is any human smart enough to predict the future. But it was really fun pulling together all the different elements and seeing how they might affect things. And I know that my bias and optimism has meant that I've kind of chosen to see the likely developments as being the ones that would lead to this somewhat utopian vision that I have for the future. But at the same time, if I can contribute to the way the world develops in any way, I want my optimism to be part of it. So I don't mind that I might have ignored some of the grim realities that we shall face along the way.
Oh, so look, I think there's a role of futurism in being optimistic, like you have done, where it can kind of set a vision for us to aspire towards. I think what you touched on there, though, during the development of this is you've also kind of picked up some of those, what we might describe as critical uncertainties, some of the really big impact shifts that might be required for such a thing to happen.
Yeah.
And we don't know necessarily which way they'll go. And a great example of this is things like UBI, or universal basic income. And so there's signals where we are seeing this being kind of talked about. We are seeing university kind of research being done, and where they're actually literally handing out free money to people in villages in Africa to see what the impact of this is over 5, 10, 15, 20-year timeframes. So this type of stuff is happening. We don't know yet whether we get it. And
the fearful thing for me is I see the logical endpoint of capitalism, as technology continues to make human labor less and less necessary or relevant to productivity. The logical endpoint of capitalism is that one megalomaniacal sociopath ends up with all the resources in the world, and the rest of us are a poor proletariat with nothing. And the huge cultural shift that is essentially necessary to my scenario playing out is a shift in our fundamental beliefs around how value is earned and shared. Because I don't think that, for example, Jeff Bezos is actually worth $250 billion or whatever he's worth today, because almost all of the value that he creates is actually downstream of the language that humans created, the computers that other humans created, the roads that other humans created, the trucks that other humans created, the boats and the aeroplanes. And like, Jeff Bezos didn't make any of those things. And the fact that he managed to create the one little system that leverages all of it to produce an insane amount of wealth doesn't, in my opinion, entitle him to all of the gains of that insane amount of wealth that is produced by that leverage. And as AI and physical automations and robotics continue to mean that we don't need humans to work to create productivity, we need a fundamental cultural shift, which is the belief that every human being, or in my personal philosophical belief, every conscious being, is worthy of the benefits of all the progress that has been made, not just a couple of generally intelligent and often sociopathic people who seek to create the most amount of leverage with that stuff. And yeah, honestly, the biggest fear or trepidation or uncertainty that exists in my scenario is that maybe we're not capable of the cultural and political shift required, and we end up instead in a dystopia where a very small number of people own nearly all the wealth and all the leverage, and the rest of us have almost all of our freedom stripped away because we're literally serfs, battling over scraps in hovels in huge megacities with almost no freedom and no joy. And yeah, it brings me no joy to consider that, but I recognize that it is like a fundamental shift that would have to happen for my scenario to become a reality.
Yeah. And interesting, like if we were doing this in a more kind of complete sense, and we don't just have a scenario, we have scenarios,
Yeah,
and we would explore what those alternative things might look like and what the triggers would be to take us down one path or the other. And there's value in both. There's value
yeah,
in both the warning against this kind of centralization of money and wealth. And then
yeah,
there's kind of the lesson or to what to be learned or how we get to something that feels more beneficial for a broader number of people. And
yeah.
then within that is also the acknowledgement that neither of these are good or bad, because good or bad in this is ultimately determined by perspective.
And now a word from our sponsors.
Instead of buying an apartment, do you wish you could buy a future? With friends? That's where Reese and Daughters comes in. For over 3 decades, Katie Reese has helped people design, plan, and build low-carbon, high-cohesion communities. Whether you're 8 friends with an urban plot or 20 families with an acreage dream, Reese and Daughters will guide you every step of the way. From legal frameworks to composting toilets, shared governance to permaculture zoning, they've done it all. Visit reeseanddaughters.com and get your free So You Think You Want a Commune starter kit. Katie Reese and Daughters, because the future isn't solo, it's shared.
I personally quite like your scenario, though. I do think that this is a really beautiful thing. And then the slightly skeptical version of me kind of goes, oh, yeah, but there's some challenges with this that we need to also talk about. So even in the utopian version, there are undercurrents of challenge that need to be probably discussed. And I think you mentioned that a little bit. In doing so, you've been thinking about, well, what are the moving parts to create it? Were you
Yeah.
also thinking about what's the moving parts in terms of sustaining it? Like if you talk about this communal group of people living together, like what are the mechanisms for them to be able to continue to do that in a healthy way?
Yeah, and like one of the things that I think one of the reasons our present system doesn't allow people to try the experiment that we're presently running, and that I hope a universal basic income and reform around housing might allow in a better future. At the moment, if a relationship breaks down, the housing situation is thrown into absolute chaos because like the average house price in Melbourne is 10 times the average family income, right? Annual family income, which means the average mortgage stretches out to 25 to 30 years. It's by far the biggest single expenditure that anyone in our present society usually makes in a whole lifetime. And when relationships break down, or because like not everyone can live harmoniously with everyone else, and people do change, and children become teenagers and gigantic shitheads. And as much as I love the idea of people living community, I recognize that sometimes just as communities form, communities also need to disband. And there's huge complexity in what I'm describing, because if a community is disbanding and, one family's leaving, well, what do you do then? Do you introduce one more family at random and hope they fit in? Or like, how do we move not just a single family into a single house? How do whole groups of people move to new housing or a new town? Like, honestly, mate, I've got no idea.
But I think this is the value of the scenario, right? Because we're going like, cool. On one hand, just disregard for a second what might have had to transpire in the world for us to get to this point. So
Yeah.
in terms of the political shifts, in terms of the economic shifts, the fact that we now have these robots and stuff now doing all the work for us, and we end up in this place. But then even then, when we're in this place, I think it probably brings to the fore some of the other challenges that sit around this, because I cannot tell you the number of conversations I have had with people over the last few years about communal living. Like,
Right.
it's almost like something that people have this kind of innate craving for. Like, there's an acknowledgement, I think, of some of your underlying beliefs, Cole, and your own personal experiences around that, the isolationism isn't good for us. It's not good for our mental health. We are meant to be there in this kind of more village-like atmosphere.
Yeah.
And yet, I think you point out that one of the kind of limitations to this at the moment is around, well, how do we afford it and afford to stay in a place with a group of people? So that's one. But I do think there's other ones around there. Yes, there's a regulatory issues and stuff at the moment where government doesn't necessarily make that easy to create communal living. But I think the one that you touched on there about, but if you've got this group of people together and then one chooses to leave, how do you actually negotiate that? How do you then choose who takes their place?
Correct.
Yeah, I think that's actually
and like
really...
we've had to deal with that in our experiment doing it here now. And the two things that we've been able to rely on to allow us to solve it is the fact that, number one, it is the commune that we're living in is centered around my wife's family. So we live with my wife's brother, his partner, their kids, and their parents live here a lot of the time. My mum lives here a lot of the time. We're largely held together by family, and it's two family groups that we had a very high confidence would maintain a harmonious relationship over a long period of time. But not only that, compared to the average person, we've got heaps of money. And so we were able, like, if someone leaves, essentially we're able to buy that bit of it out. And so there's some security in the fact that we won't be forced to sell the whole place just because, one person or one group decided to opt out. We have the financial means to fill the hole that is left in a financial sense. And yeah, like if we're all living on a universal basic income, that's not going to be the solution. We're not all going to have bags of cash sitting out the back that we can deploy if necessary. There's going to need to be some kind of regulatory, societal, cultural, and whether it is literally monetary policy or social norms that allow us to experiment with different, elements of the tribe. And like, I love the idea. I'm not an urban person myself. I don't want to live in a city, but I recognize that the idea of 15-minute cities, I think, is very much aligned with what I'm trying to do here. 15-minute cities are saying, can we allow people to live in urban areas, but where everything they need is within a 15-minute walk? And within that 15-minute walk would include family and friends. And so I hope that governments who are designing 15-minute cities come up with, I don't know if it's social housing or like the way that housing is bought, sold, regulated to keep pricing at a level where houses almost become more fungible and you can move to one more easily and move out of one more easily. At the moment, moving house is a disaster economically in many cases. And yeah, I'm not an economist nor a futurist. I don't know what the answer is there. And the contribution I think I can make is around the value of the communal living. And I hope that other people smarter than me can work out what are the actual regulatory and process steps that we need to take to make it a reality for as many people, the greatest percentage of our population as we possibly can.
Yeah, well, you mentioned obviously that you see this point in the future, maybe a decade from now, where you write a book. And the immediate thing I thought was like, well, you probably shouldn't write it by yourself, right?
Yeah, no,
if it's
definitely
a book about
not.
communal living, it should be written communally. And this idea that we would have different people who've got different strengths to bring to that conversation. And so, yeah, I love the idea of having a communal book about communal living. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, well, I literally think there'll be a chapter by my 18-year-old son. He'd be 18 then, and my 16-year-old daughter, and my 14-year-old son, and Ben's partner Georgie. And do you know what I mean? Like the book would be written by this community in service to hopefully other future communities. So yeah, that's a super fun idea.
So I love there's a concept that I read in a book recently by Jay Kunzo, his book called Breaking the Wheel. And it wasn't his quote, but it was attributed to someone else in the book. But he said in it, the idea that the future doesn't repeat. Sorry, the history doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. And
yeah, I've heard that one before. Yeah.
Yeah. And this concept that in the certain aspects of this, feel like, it rhymes with the 1960s and kind of hippie culture and communal living, but then it also rhymes with kind of more, more ancient village type models of
Correct.
living, right?
Yeah, that's the bit. So I wouldn't consider myself particularly woo-woo. I like to think of myself as a rationalist. I certainly take most of my opinions, or I try to take my opinions from the experts in any given field and the research that they've done. And my general perspective on what is likely to produce well-being in any biological animal or structure is, well, whatever it's the natural environment that it evolved in is. And so if what's going to create well-being in a human being is essentially whatever conditions were likely to have existed in the place where we evolved. And the research points towards living in groups of 30 to 150 of multigenerational, largely related, communal living, and even to the point of like, what types of food did we eat? And in the sense, what I want is for our future to rhyme with that past. And I don't want to regress to that past. I don't want to have infant mortality at 30% or 50% or 80%. Like, I want many of the benefits of advancing technology, but I want our daily experience and our relationships to rhyme with what I imagine the depth of relationships were and the trust that existed in relationships were and the time span of the relationships that we would have had 3,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, because they are the conditions under which our brain evolved. And they are the conditions which I expect are most likely to produce long-term well-being in the brains that we've got. Our brains are not evolving anywhere near as fast as technology is. And so we should be applying technology to create the conditions where our brains get to exist as they could have or should have. And community, I believe, is central to that.
So when you first shared this idea of this scenario with me, I shared it with a couple of other people, and because of what that rhyme came up for me, I thought about that kind of village way of living. I've got a good friend of mine, Roy, who's Balinese. He comes from the island of Lambongan, just off the coast of Bali. And we've talked a lot in the past around the difference in the way we live in Western society versus how they traditionally live in a lot of Southeast Asian communities. And I shared the same conversation with June, who works in my team, who's based in the Philippines. And they still have these models, though some of those models are under threat from a kind of sense of modernism. And so one of the models and the kind of fundamental principles of it is that, so Roy has basically said, look, so my job is to, my dad's job was to look after the family until he retires. He retires at 60. After that, it's the family's job to look after him.
Yep.
And what that really means is it's not necessarily Roy's job. It's actually Roy's wife's job to do that. Roy's wife, and he had to have this conversation with his wife before they got married to say, do you still agree with these kind of traditional principles? Because a lot of younger females and young men are choosing to say, no, I'm not buying into that anymore. I want the modernism version where I have my own apartment with the TV and I choose the colors of the paint on the walls. Right?
Yep.
But that's kind of the agreement that kind of Roy had to make with his wife to make sure that now that his dad is literally just retired, she's now going back to the village to provide that support. It's like his superannuation.
Yeah.
So one of the first things that struck me in this is like, so you've got this scenario where your daughter Darwin is still living in your commune.
Yeah.
Right. But if we kind of have different kind of rules and how are we going to manage this when, Darwin's partner has their own commune? What makes you think Darwin's staying in your one?
100%. She could choose the other. And so there is no such thing as utopia, right? Like utopia where everyone gets what they want, that's not a thing. And so I am realistic. And one of the things that I'm realistic about is I don't think that we're going to get to the endpoint that I imagine is possible. I don't think is going to happen in my lifetime. And one of the reasons is because people who are wedded to old ways of thinking essentially just need to die off to allow new generations to embrace it. But as an example of how I could see society growing over time to make what I'm talking about more possible. I don't think you can tell anyone what to do, but what you can do is demonstrate to them the value of certain choices that they can make, and which makes it more or less likely that they will make similar choices. And so my kids, who I hope I'm giving a head start on this, like a way of potentially living in the future, they're going to get raised in this communal environment. They're going to see my mum live out the last of her days and die here on this property. And they're going to see me make whatever sacrifices I need to make that happen. I don't care how hard it is. I don't care what I have to do. My mum gave me the most amazing life. I'm going to make sure she gets to live out her life with her family here. And I'm going to make whatever sacrifices required, not on the presumption or the caveat or the condition that Darwin, Deacon, or Caspian will do that for me, but to set an example of how I want old people in our society to be treated. And I think that makes it more likely, not certain, but it makes it more likely that they would make a choice like that for me or for Mish or for the other older people in their lives. Even if Mish and Ben both died, I'll look after both their parents here because I think that's the right thing to do. And I think that those ideas, those memes about caring for each other and looking out for each other and doing the hard things in community as well as the easy things in community, I just think it makes it more likely over time that more and more people will subscribe to those ideas. And I reckon you can actually already see that in today's society when you look at Italian and Greek immigrant communities who moved to Australia in the 1950s. And what we saw was houses that were cheap enough that allowed them to buy within 2 minutes walk of each other. They would buy 6 houses in a street. And it meant that Nonna looked after all the kids, right, when the parents were working. And it means that the parents looked after Nonna, right? And so those communities, in a different way that I've done it, but honestly, I think they're demonstrating the same thing. They showed how housing affordability leads to communal situations. And now the young men and women that they raised are incredibly loyal to and caring for their older generations. They have a level of respect and care for their elders, and they look after them and they make great decisions for them. And they do that because they saw their parents do it. And their parents did it because they saw their parents do it. And I just think that Western culture's forgotten how to do that. But we don't have to forget forever. We can learn to do it again. And it's not about forcing anyone to do something, but it is about showing them that it's possible, which influences their likely future choices.
That's really just something that made me, when you were going through that, it's interesting. And you said this earlier on, that you have created this experience for your family and your extended family group through a position of privilege.
Yeah.
When I kind of talk to people, though, like my friend Roy and to June about this, it's not actually generated through privilege. It's actually generated through hardship. It's generated necessity. I remember we're up there at Christmas and my wife Gnomes was talking to Roy and says, "But what happens if your mum or dad gets sick?" And he goes, he was almost like that was will you just look after them? Because there is no hospital.
What else would you do?
But there's no health care. There's no hospital to send them to. There's no aged care facility they go to.
Correct.
You just look after them until they pass away.
Yep.
And so there is a necessity basis of that. There was nothing else we could do. We had to do that. And I do think that actually, weirdly, there's a slightly more dystopian way of getting to this scenario in the future, which is not one that comes from privilege, but it comes from disadvantage, is that these family groups are forced to reconnect with each other and reform these kind of village, communal type living arrangements because we can't afford not to. And I find that's an interesting, and wonder even if there's certainly, I know it sounds weird, but certain advantages to that, that it comes through hardship rather than comes through privilege.
Correct. And one way that it could happen in a place like Australia where housing affordability is terrible and getting worse is people are simply forced by economics not to live in Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane or Adelaide or Perth. And that instead they have to move to, I don't know, Castlemaine or Orange or Parkes or Ipswich or Toowoomba or I don't know. I'm listing random towns, but essentially we may be forced by economics to experiment with living not in 5 metropolises dotted on the coast, but instead in smaller regional towns throughout the country. And if a group of friends, the interesting thing is I know a bunch of people who've moved to Bendigo or moved to Ballarat or moved to the outskirts of Geelong, and they love it. And once they've left Melbourne, they're like, I don't know what I was so afraid of. It's awesome out here. We love it. And maybe a complete lack of housing affordability will actually be the trigger that leads a group of people to go, you know what? None of us can afford to live in Melbourne. Screw it. Let's just all move to Bairnsdale, but we'll all buy in the same street. So at least whilst we're miles away from where we grew up, we're at least together. And one of the things that I want to see Western society do is take the groups that form through the share housing process when you go to university, right? What happens when you go to university is you experiment with different share houses until you find the 5 people who you can spend an unlimited amount of time with without getting tired of them, right? And when you're in 6th year university because you failed 8 units, you found the 5 people who you can tolerate in unlimited amounts. It is my very firm belief that those are the people you should set up your community with, because you can tolerate everything about each other. And then you just bring in a few, wives and husbands and kids and whatever, but you form the core of your little community. And maybe a complete lack of housing affordability will mean that a share house in Brunswick goes, you know what? Fuck it, let's move to Bairnsdale, but we'll all buy in the one street and we'll hang out together. Maybe that's the dystopian way to reach my future utopia.
I feel like the real losers in this scenario, Cole, are the people who kind of pass university the first time. It's like...
exactly, you don't have time.
I've only got 3 years. It's like, I'm not sure if these are the right people.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's great. It means you factor in a little bit of benefit for the dysfunction that we all exhibit as 21-year-olds.
One other thing that came up for me in reading this, I'm very fascinated with the formation of groups and how we see our sense of identity. And in this, and I think in your own personal story, Cole, there's a real sense of identity that's connected to the communal environment or the communal situation that you're living in. It's like, these are my people, right? The problem with any kind of sense of group like that is when we have an in-group, we also have an out-group. And so our connection to other groups around us is not as strong because we have such a strong sense of identity with this group that we're in. And I kind of wonder around, like, we have, I know, on one hand, I feel we are on an evolutionary process towards seeing ourselves as global citizens. And we've kind of gone through the model of, we went through the village, and we went to the town, and went to the city, and then we kind of become this, there's good and bad versions of the nationalistic aspect of this.
Definitely.
But there are certain people from a consciousness perspective kind of go, yeah, right. But the next step clearly then is one of internationalism, of that we are part of a global community. And I kind of feel in this scenario, there's a risk that we kind of almost shun a little bit of that for the sake of, but these are the people around me. What do you see as being that? Because I think on one way you kind of try and bridge those two things yourself, both being a global citizen, but how do you see this playing out in this scenario?
Yeah, I think this is one of the complexities of operating in a modern environment with a prehistoric operating system, right? Like, we evolved in bands of 30 to 150 people, and the biological operating system that we've been gifted was designed to thrive under those conditions. And it also gave us an ability to cooperate on a grand scale unheard of in the natural world anywhere else. Like, humans are the ultimate cooperators at the level of millions and billions, right? And I am not in the least bit nationalist. I don't think that a person born in Australia deserves more of my kindness than a person born in any other random country, because where you're born and who you're born to is a complete fluke, and there's no kind of, you don't deserve any credit for that. And so my vision for a future would be a really healthy global government. Like, I would love it if the ultimate arbiter in the end was a UN or something related to it. And at the same time, what I have noticed, or at least what I believe I've seen, I don't consider myself a political scientist by any stretch of the imagination, is that top-down leadership has limited utility in the real world, and that we need a combination of top-down leadership where we, for example, tackle things like carbon emissions. That has to be done from the very top down. Governments around the world have to cooperate and form global rules that we all adhere to, as we did so successfully with chlorofluorocarbons and the hole in the ozone layer. We need to do those things at the very top level and filter the behaviours down. And in the other direction, I reckon the minutiae of day-to-day, like the reason capitalism has been so effective is never has there been a better system of distributed decision-making and resource allocation. And whilst in my vision of the future, and I think this is probably several hundred years away, we would have a global government and we all essentially consider ourselves to be a member of a single enormous nation, lots of decisions will happen at local level. And like, I know you're an expert in local government, and that you see the best way for you to influence the world around you is to help local governments make great decisions for the communities of, I don't know, what are the numbers, 10 to 100,000, 200,000 people at a
100,000
time?
people is probably, for a municipal local government, cities might be a bit bigger, but 100,000 people is probably about the mark.
Right. And I think the world is a substantially better place because you do that work. And the fact that you're focusing on these groups of 100,000 people at a time doesn't need to be to the exclusion or detriment of all others. It simply says, we're going to focus on this area and make decisions at this level, which are the best for these people, whilst also taking into account the impacts and ramifications of what the decisions we make at this level have when we look at the national or global scale. And equally, I see my focus as at the level of 10 to 20 or 30 people, right? You're trying to help people make great decisions at the level of 100,000. I'm trying to help people make great decisions at the level of below 100. And there will be other people with bigger brains than you or me who are trying to help make great decisions at the level of 10 billion. And I think all of us have an opportunity and an obligation to contribute at the level, and that all those levels are important because the whole thing is not a monolith. It's a deeply complex adaptive system, like ridiculously complex adaptive system. And utopia is one where the governance at the overall level is functional and healthy and useful, but also at every level below that, whether we're talking about 10 billion people or 1 billion people or 1 million people or 100,000 people or 1,000 people or 10 people. And different people will have perspectives that are useful at those different levels. And I just see myself as being most interested by and having the most sort of expertise to offer at almost the very smallest level.
So I said earlier on, there was a thread that I wanted to pull, and which was about the conversation you had about Cam and playing guitar in the corner of the room at the end of your life, which is beautiful and what an amazing sentiment. But what it made me really think about was about what it is that we, choose to spend our time doing. That you said when you grew up, instead of listening to records or CDs, you got to listen to Cam. And that you valued that because of the effort that Cam's put into the live experience. And throughout our life, we get made choices between what we choose to automate and what we choose to put our effort into.
Yeah.
I think it was like in the book 4,000 Weeks. I think it's like one of the conclusions of the book is effectively we are what we give our time to.
Yep.
In your scenario, there's some certain choices around, or certain, I suppose, pointers as to what it is that gets automated and what doesn't. And I know there's only some broad brushstroke stuff in there, but like we don't automate schooling.
Yeah.
Right? Do automate food production.
Yeah.
Right? Don't automate guitar playing in the corner. That's definitely
not. Yeah.
Just if you think about that, like in this idealistic utopian world that you are describing, what are some of the things that you would go, these are the things that we should never automate. These are the things that we should hold close to us. These are things that even though they're hard, we should continue to do them because they are the things that I think what really shape us or shape good us.
Yeah. We should never automate becoming better people. So I think, so the most watched TED Talk of all time is the one by Sir Ken Robinson, now sadly deceased. And the core message in that TED Talk, which nearly everybody listening to this podcast has surely seen, is that school is killing creativity in our children. And the reason is because there's an element of school, and I say this not to besmirch teachers, because scarcely could there be a group of people who I respect more, right? But there is an element of our present educational paradigm, which is, it's not an educational system, it's an industrial childcare system. And I reckon that the subtle and pernicious effects of that have been very deep and very damaging. And I don't believe that most kids are born to be bullies. I believe the system that we are allowing to raise them is what is causing them to behave like bullies. And again, I think biological beings are most likely to flourish under the conditions under which they evolved. That's just a fundamental belief of mine. Children didn't evolve with one adult to 30 kids in a year level of 150 to 300 kids. Kids didn't get raised by other kids, and not by other kids who were all exactly the same age within kind of 12 to 18 months of each other. Kids grew up in communities where they were taught by an 80-year-old, a 60-year-old, a 40-year-old, a 20-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 7-year-old while they were 3. And we should never seek to automate raising new people, and we should never seek to automate dying. Both of those things are like the most human things that we can do, and I think that we should be with our children when they're born. I think we should be with them as they grow, and I think they should be with us when we die. And not all of it's going to be fun, but I think in total, what it is what's good for you. And it's what creates the most well-being overall. And that is what is important to me in the way we live our lives.
Well, that's going to be a beautiful juxtaposition against the previous episode, which was around the future of death and dying for people who are listening back to back. So hey, we're almost out of time, but before we go, I wanted to ask you, and I know you did touch on this a little bit before when you were talking about the process of developing the scenarios, but I'm really interested to know what you have taken out of this experience, because on one hand, I know that you are so deeply invested in creating this, but even I'm interested in knowing, has this conversation or even this exercise of creating a scenario, how has it shaped your thinking around what it is that you're trying to create, how it is you might share it with others, or even just more broadly in terms of this obsession and I suppose that you have around, meaningful and freedomful life?
It's been really useful. And as a person who's long flirted with the idea of creating a book or some other kind of lasting record of what we're trying to do here, it's been really useful because obviously you being a trained futurist with a heap of experience and insight about ways that we can approach thinking about the future, I've always done it completely intuitively and kind of while I'm doing other things. Like I'll think about this stuff while I'm building a fence or fixing my truck or whatever. Like it's just something that bubbles along on the verge of my subconscious and conscious like intersection. And what you've given me here was an opportunity to approach it in a very conscious way. And what that did is open up a lot more threads than it closed, to be perfectly honest. But I'm really excited about that because I feel like the next 2 or 3 months is likely to be a really exciting period of ideation and exploration for me, because this process, both the kind of prompts that you gave me to start with and then the conversation and the various threads that you've tugged thanks to your own curiosity, has opened up a whole heap of unanswered questions and curiosities in my mind. And I think now I'm going to explore a bunch of those things in much greater depth than I might have if I just approached the whole thing intuitively. So the part that I've really appreciated about it is having kind of a framework and a structure and some guidance around how do you even think about the future. And my temptation now is for our next conversation, whether it's recorded or not, I want to do one on like a 3 to 5 year horizon for the community that I'm building and because I've just seen how powerful this process has been doing it for this more abstract and bigger and more longer term idea, and I'm now interested in doing a more concrete thing with a tighter time horizon, because I feel like that might create some opportunities that I can pursue in a really tangible way starting tomorrow. So it's been super fun, and I've really appreciated the opportunity, and hopefully you and anyone else who's listened to it has found something useful in it from my contribution.
Well, first of all, it'd be an absolute privilege to do that with you. And yes, 100%, there'd be so much to be learned about what happens in that near future. But to be honest, it's just been awesome to have you on the show. I think so many people are going to listen to this and feel inspired by that vision that you have created. And I think the willingness that you have shown to invest in this, like quite literally financially and with your time, to actually explore what this looks like, I find that super inspiring. Because as I said, I've had so many conversations that are around this idea over the last few years. To hear your story, to think about what that might evolve into, I think is super inspiring for a lot of people. So thank you so much.
Love it. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, and I know we will get a chance to talk again in the very near future. But until then, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Simon. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, that is all for this week's episode of The Future with Friends. If you've enjoyed the episode and you want to support the show, the number one thing you can do is share it with your friends. In fact, it would give me no greater joy than to think in a small way the conversations I'm having with my friends could be a positive influence on the conversations that you are having with yours. Other ways to support the show include going onto the podcasting platform of your choice and giving us a rating. Obviously, I would like it to be 5 stars, but you should ultimately do whatever feels right for you. And if you don't feel quite ready for that yet, if we're not at that point in our relationship, the other thing you can do is send me small gifts in the mail. I always enjoy receiving them. Well, that is all for this week. We will be back in another couple of weeks with the next episode. And so until then, my friends, I look forward to seeing you again.